So your book, The Soliloquies in Old English and in Latin, turns 3 years old in a month from now, or at least a month from when this will come out. That book, The Soliloquies, written by Saint Augustine, of Hippo, certainly, and most people will know him from his work, The Confessions. That's his most famous, I think. And then people will probably have heard of his City of God book, which I recently made a video on. The Soliloquies, not so much, but it seems to have been pretty important to medieval scholars and medieval authors. So, what could you tell us about sort of the general style and thrust of the work? What produced them? What kind of topics does Augustine talk about in this book?
It's funny that you lead with Confessions and City of God, because once when I was giving a talk at Notre Dame on glossed manuscripts of the Soliloquia, I led with exactly that point. This was in the Medieval Institute, and so I knew people had read Augustine, but I said, okay, raise your hand if you've read the Confessions. Raise your hand if you've read the City of God. And almost everyone's putting their hand up. Again, consider the audience. But when I asked people, have you read the soliloquies? Very few had. Some people had read sort of the Cassiciacum dialogues as a whole. But the reason why I really like that you frame it that way first is because it's the opposite for early medieval readers when the Confessions was not widely circulating and City of God not widely circulating in far Western Europe. That starts to change in the 11th century, but it means that readers who were approaching the Soliloquia, they were doing that without City of God and Confessions filling in a lot of the biographical gaps about Augustine. And so now when I'm looking at the Soliloquia, I'm trying to unsee everything that I've absorbed from teaching the Confessions to undergrads a whole bunch of times. We can't know that he is about to become a priest or a bishop or do any of the things that he was going to do in later life. We can't know what his positions were going to become on things like the origins of the soul, for instance. And so there's a lot of, if we want to study the early medieval reception of the Latin soliloquia, there's a lot that we have to do to ignore what scholarship has done to synthesize this historical Augustine for us. Because the interlocutor in the Soliloquia, who's called Augustinus, is pretty autobiographical in an awful lot of ways, so it's very tempting. Let's just fill in the blanks. In England in particular, I think that lack of access to those two big works, the Confessions and the City of God, really shapes some of the translators' decisions. And we can come back to that when we talk about the Old English. You asked sort of what the style and the thrust of that work is, Soliloquia, that is. I guess one place to start would be thinking about if we go to the Confessions and think about that part just after Augustine has had his big conversion moment, the tolle lege moment in the garden at Milan. When he knows he's going to convert, he needs to prepare for a few months. And he goes on a retreat with some of his friends at Cassiciacum. That's when he writes the Cassiciacum dialogues, and also probably the Soliloquia is from that period as well. So he's isolated with like-minded men and thinking through philosophical problems. The interesting thing about this being a soliloquy, but it's also a dialogue, because as Augustine sets up the problem at the beginning, he wants to know God and the soul, but what intervenes in his mind is this thing that he doesn't know whether it's inside him or outside him, but it's going to teach him to know about these things. One thing I would add, it becomes clear to us immediately that this interlocutor of Augustine's is a personification of his faculty of reason, called ratio, right? But the manuscript tradition took a long time to get interlocutor sigla added to the changes of speaker. And so ratio does not identify herself at the very beginning of the Latin soliloquies, except in the manuscripts that have the speaker cues. And those speaker cues are really being developed in the 8th and 9th centuries. We have copies of some of our earliest surviving copies of the Latin soliloquia either don't have interlocutor cues, so it doesn't spoil the surprise when a third of the way in she's like, I am reason. You're like, oh. And then there are others where those interlocutor sigla have been added. So we know that in the time period that we're looking at, not everyone who was reading would have known immediately who's talking to Augustinus in this dialogue. The things that they cover, I mean, again, he says at the beginning he wants to know about the soul and know about God. And specifically, he's going to want to know whether the soul is immortal. And the way that Ratio guides him through discovering this stuff has to do with different types of knowledge and truth and falsehood, or falsity, not necessarily intentional falsehood, but what makes something true and what makes something false. And where they end up at the end of book two, Ratio has convinced Augustinus that truth is immortal and that truth must reside in the soul, but there's a problem. It hasn't been confirmed that truth must always reside in the same soul, or that the soul must continue to exist, the individual soul must continue to exist to house truth. It could be that truth moves from one soul to another if souls are mortal. And Ratio says, I really need a third book if we're going to discuss this further. And Augustine doesn't write that third book. He writes notes for it in De Immortalitate Animae, which gets published, but not by his own consent. So that's where the question is left, and it's going to require other philosophical means to sort out the rest of the problem.
Yeah, so the Old English edition I remember mentions Davidendo Deo as like another text to go on. I've never read that before. I don't know anything about it. But does Augustine cover it more in that?
No, not really. The reason why David Endodeo is useful there, one of the things that is covered along the way in the Latin Soliloquia certainly is the relationship between ascetic self-denial and one's ability to see God and understand God. And that falls under the rubric of the types of knowledge that one gets to know if one wants to know about God and the soul. But I actually don't think that the translator of the Old English fully knew what he was talking about when he talks about David Endodeo. I strongly suspect that he didn't know that work was by Augustine and he had read excerpts of it in a Florilegium, because it's a pretty weird joke to play when you've got the interlocutor Augustinus being told by Ratio, "Hey, go read this dialogue that, or this letter, Epistula 147, that you're going to write in a decade or two." That's a pretty sophisticated joke. I don't credit that being what the translator was trying to do. There's a lot of instances in which patristic works are quoted in a Florilegium, either with the wrong attribution or with no attribution whatsoever, or there's an eius dem at the beginning and you lose track of who that author was that originally had a name several entries earlier. So David Endodeo is not much help with following up book two of the soliloquies, but it is helpful in some of the concerns that book three raises. And book three applies some very different approaches to understanding the immortality of the soul, specifically like the Dives and Lazarus story.
hmm So, and just for the sake of the listener, the word that was just used, eustem, that means like of the same. So, if you've got a
Right.
list of works and one is by, say Boethius, and the next one, if it says eustem, it means by the same person that is by Boethius. Which, by the way, speaking of Boethius, it's a bit odd how similar these two works are. I mean, the Consolation of Philosophy I read much prior to the soliloquies. And there are times where I'll remember something from the soliloquies and be like, oh, I want to read that section of the Consolation again. And then I'll be like, no, it's not from the Consolation, it's from the soliloquies. Do you think there's anything to that?
There is an article. I am embarrassed that I cannot remember who wrote it. It's a early 20th century article talking about Boethius, positing that Boethius was drawing direct connections with Augustine's Soliloquia. This would be a much more helpful comment for me to make if I could actually remember the author of this article. But I think that the other thing to comment on is that I know we're going to get to the Old English later, but for a long
Mhm.
time people were just like, why would anyone translate Augustine's Soliloquia into Old English around the year 900? Like, what was the point of that? I think it's exactly what you just said. The Consolation of Philosophy had already become a schoolroom text in Carolingian circles. Ælfredian circles and his successors are trying to emulate Carolingian learning, except that Boethius takes it for granted that his audience believes in the immortality of the soul. He even says so outright once, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't think you can take that for granted among an audience whose folk psychology, the way ordinary people thought about mind, soul, and body, really allied the mind much more with the body, thought of the mind as something that might perish along with the body when the soul goes off to heaven. And with it, really the individuality of the person, because the soul doesn't have a lot of individuality or agency in many of the portrayals of human anthropology as they appear mostly in Old English. A lot of the well, you think of soul and body, for instance. It's the
Mhm.
body that's very willful and the soul that's just kind of at the mercy of the body. The soul doesn't boss the body around in much Old English stuff the way he does, or the way it does in Alcuin's De Anima Ratione.
Mhm.
And so I think that the concerns of Augustine in the Soliloquia to explore why the soul is immortal are rooted in a different place. It's philosophical skepticism of the sort that concludes Cicero's Hortensius.
Mhm.
But in Old English, an Old English audience would have been thinking about the mode, hye, seva, ferth, and all the times that it appears that that is not the soul, that it's part of the body, that it resides in the heart, that it's subject to changes in temperature and pressure, and that that very individualized and willful part of the human dies with the body, and it's a less personal soul that goes on to enjoy the afterlife.
Mm. So the Soliloquia text in Latin per se, the one written like by Augustine, what do you find most interesting about it? Like if you were to recommend it to someone, what would be the reasons why?
I was glad that you let me prepare some thoughts about this in advance. I can't I can't answer this in a way that doesn't reveal much more about myself than about the text, because I'll tell you why I love it. I love it for what it tells me about what people in the 8th, ninth, 10th centuries were mulling over about mind and soul. I would
Mhm.
never say that this doesn't have merit or interest on its own. And I think, if you're, especially if you are studying Latin style, it's very compact and Ciceronian. It's quite different from anything that I've worked with up close in other texts because I haven't worked with a lot of Cicero or a
Mhm.
ton of classical philosophy. So I've really enjoyed learning how Augustine deploys the turns of phrase that he used from his philosophical education. I enjoy seeing what he and Ratio, or his interlocutor figure and Ratio, think qualifies as valid argumentation about the nature and the immortality of the soul, which of course Augustine comes back to in a number of other works. But really, my favorite thing about it is seeing the reception in early medieval manuscripts and then seeing how it's adapted into Old English, because it really, I think it is a great compliment with an E, to Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, because it fills in some of those gaps about, no, we don't just have to take Boethius's word for it. This is why the soul is immortal. And then when we see people engaging with the text in manuscript by leaving glosses and construal marks, and commentary in the manuscripts, it's actually mostly not what you would expect. There's one manuscript, a mid-9th century manuscript from probably the Lens Soissons region, that includes some philosophical, theological commentary. This is Karlsruhe, Augperg 195. Most of the time, though, the things that people are interested in are these strange tidbits about Augustine. He had a toothache, right? And people have read about that and wanted, oh, Augustine had toothache, just like it's just a little note in the margin that this was interesting to them. I think the most frequently glossed thing of all of the manuscripts I've studied has been the mention of the crocodile in Book Two, because Augustine, Ratio asks Augustine, is there something you can think of in nature that is the only representative of its category? And Augustine says, well, the crocodile is the only animal that chews by raising and lowering its top jaw rather than raising and lowering its bottom jaw. And almost every time in the margin, corcodrilum. I just found that really interesting. And there's a really unsavory cliche saying, proverb almost, that Augustine borrows from Cicero that basically says, was it, all fools are madmen in the same way that all excrement stinks, but you don't notice till you stir it up. It's like, but people marked that all the time. I don't know if it was out of shock or, wow, that's clever, I want to remember that. And a couple manuscripts, they misattribute the quotation to Chrysippus, of all people. So that kind of thing is what I really love about the Soliloquia, is that it fed a lot of different scholarly appetites. And yes, I recommend reading it to get to know Augustine in a pre-confessions framework, but I also recommend thinking about all the strange things that people did with it centuries after Augustine. And of course, for the Carolingians, it also really shaped the way they argued, because it modeled the use of the Aristotelian categories in the form of the Decem Categoriae, and that really took off in Carolingian theology and philosophy. But a lot of that was stimulated by the study of the Soliloquia.
hmm I really love that toothache part. I mean, it was exactly like what you say, where it's like, oh my gosh, like Augustine had a toothache. Like I've had a toothache before. It was he had such, it was so witty too. He mentions it at one point and then he brings it up again, saying like, oh yeah, like I struggled with toothaches and I know that there are worse things to struggle with. And then he kind of adds it as a side, but like I've never personally experienced anything worse than that. And
Yeah.
it's pretty funny. It's this kind of like dry humor of like, well, I am he's being honest with himself that, he hasn't actually experienced that much hardship, but then
Yeah.
he's kind of laughing at the fact that it was still difficult for him. And I think in general, the style that he writes with is really appealing. I mostly only read classical Latin, and so usually medieval Latin is very kind of odd and jarring for me.
Yeah.
But when I sat down and really read through the City of God recently because I wanted to prepare for the video that I was making on it, and I was really taken aback by how good his Latin is. And he was a native Latin speaker, so who am I to say that his Latin was good or bad? But it was very beautiful. I think it was very like rhetorically adept and very Ciceronian, as you say. I really liked it.
Yeah, like I said, the Ciceronian stuff is a little alien to me, but I love how it enables this sharp wit, right? And it enables them to be cool and calm and collected in their dialogue, which is actually one of the points when Ratio is saying, well, you know why we're doing this as a soliloquium, right? It's because if you bring other philosophers in here and talk about this, you're likely to get worked up and yell at each other. And so most of it is about staying calm and collected and being super rational, but sometimes the interlocutor, Augustine, gets really upset, right? When Ratio shows that he hasn't gotten rid of his sexual desires to the extent that he thinks he has, or when he can't follow her reasoning. There's these moments where the emotion breaks through, and the fact that it's been so clipped and compact and witty all along. And when that disintegrates, it really shows up, I think. And because I know that spoken classical Latin is of importance to you, I'll just put in an aside that um, not that I apologize necessarily for relentlessly using medieval and Italianate pronunciation, but as I always tell my students, or the students and faculty both who come to the medieval Latin reading group that I host online, I sing in a choir where we use Italianate Latin pronunciation, and I can't code switch. So I'm all Italianate all the time.
Yeah, I also sing in a I've been singing my whole life and generally like more classical music. And so it's very difficult when I'll be speaking to my friends in Latin. And then I remember one time in particular, I had just started cantoring at a church, at a Roman Catholic church. And I was sort of assigned to sing all of this Latin music, but there was no organist. There was no sort of person to watch over me as I prepared it and stuff like that, which was
That's
very new for me.
terrifying.
Usually I have, yeah, yeah, and then you know how it is. Usually there's like some sort of director telling you how to do things. And so I just wasn't really thinking about the pronunciation aspect. I was like, it's Latin, it'll be fine. And I get about halfway through the mass and I realize that I'm singing in classical pronunciation. And everyone else in the congregation is singing in ecclesiastical. And afterwards, the priest came up to me and says, it's pronounced Agnus, not Agnus. Like he was pretty mad. He was like it's Gloriae, not Gloriae. And so I had to really sit down and learn ecclesiastical
Yeah.
pronunciation on my own as opposed to just being told how to say something.
Did you direct him to
Um,
the website about, the spoken Latin? Because
I should have, yeah, I should have. And actually, there's quite a bit of spoken Latin that's done in ecclesiastical pronunciation,
Right, right.
mostly by the church. But yeah, it was. Oh, what was I going to say? The interesting thing about Augustine specifically, I went into preparing my video on him expecting to pronounce everything in ecclesiastical because I was like, it's Augustine, medieval, not really classical. I didn't realize we actually know a good amount about his dialect of Latin, that is like this sort of North African Latin, and they don't have palatalization. It
Oh,
never
really?
palatalized. Yeah,
Oh,
and
that's
we
cool.
actually can tell because of the loans into like Moroccan and Arabic from that period, and then also Sardinian Italian is the only dialect of Italian that doesn't have palatal. It's so cool. It's so
It is
cool how much
cool.
we know about it. But I don't want
Yeah.
to get us too off topic.
Can I ask you one more question on that front?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
You know that the rhyming poem that he wrote, it's against the Donatists, right? I was curious whether the end rhymes tell us anything about how he was pronouncing his vowels and whether the AE diphthongs would rhyme with an E at the end or anything like
That's
that.
a Yeah, that's a great question. The
I
only
have
thing I know
not,
about vowels is that he does complain at one point that
of course
North
he does.
Africans can't understand the difference between vowel lengths, which I guess tells us that in Rome perhaps they were still observed at the time, but not
Yeah.
in Hippo. But no, I haven't looked into that. That's a really interesting query. I do want to look into that. That sounds
I taught that text to a medieval Latin class a number of years ago, but I wasn't thinking about pronunciation. I was just thinking about meter. So, at any
right. Yeah.
rate, of
Well, no, I do want to look into that later, but okay, sorry, not to get us too off track.
course.
In terms of we've talked a bit about already the sort of influence that the soliloquies have on the medieval world. Could you speak a bit specifically to that? So, do we know how early or how widely they were read in just medieval Europe in general?
Um, the earliest surviving manuscript that we have is a late 8th century manuscript from Nonantala, or they think it's from Nonantala, that vicinity based on paleography. That seems to be some stages removed from an originary text, partly because of the mise en page. And a lot of the interlocutor cues have been added by a later hand, but not all of them. It sort of
Mhm.
shows a transition from having those not marked to having them marked. So that's late 8th century northern Italy. Right around the same time, also northern Italy, right? There's a Verona manuscript that has the Munich passages that are associated with Alcuin and Candidus in that circle, and they quote long passages from the Soliloquia, again showing mostly how to deploy the Aristotelian categories in theological argumentation. There's a little bit earlier use of it in, is it Cumian's Easter letter? So Irish text, if I'm remembering right, 7th century. Forgive me if that's supposed to be 8th century. I wasn't thinking about Cumian when I was thinking about answers today. But there is, this is a really interesting problem because Cumian quotes the Soliloquia with this weird interpolation that is in other Irish authors. And so it is a quotation of the Soliloquia, but it has already been through some Irish touching up or elaboration, probably just with some glosses that then accidentally got interpolated that were mistaken for main text. But really, I think it's the Carolingian period is the place where people were giving the most attention to it, the most renewed attention to it. I don't know of any late antique engagement at length with it. And I think that the utility, again, in the Carolingian world has to do with how useful it was for the kind of philosophical and theological argumentation that they were doing for them to be able to invoke those Aristotelian categories.
Interesting. So, uh, in the English period, we do see it. I think I know Alcuin mentions Augustine by name several times as being influential. I assume that this is what he's talking about. The soliloquies. I'm not
Hmm.
totally certain on that. I guess that's just a guess. We probably don't know. But at least in the court of Wessex, by the time of King Alfred. We know that they were reading it because it gets translated, and it appears as one
Right.
of these Alfredian translations, so called because for a while they were attributed to King Alfred by, I think already in Middle English, people were starting to say that this was all written by King Alfred. Nowadays, though, not so much. And you've written a bit about this. Could you tell us, is the Soliloquies translation from Latin into Old English, is that written by King Alfred?
Um, I tend not to think so. We don't have any smoking gun, of course. I'm pretty well persuaded by Malcolm Godden's argument, which then Susan Irvine has also accepted in both their joint publications and her own writing, that the perspective represented in the Old English Boethius and Old English Soliloquies, so hard to attribute that to a king. It's the position of a courtier who is reliant on the whims of someone who definitely ranks above him. And once, I mean, a long time ago, before I thought about the authorship question, and in fact, Godden published his article on the player king before he came out and rejected Alfredian authorship. Like the closing lines of the article are, if we didn't know better, we would assume this was written by one of Alfred's courtiers or courtier to someone in the succeeding decades, because it doesn't speak to the concerns of a king. In fact, it's quite unfriendly to kings. It talks about, well, Augustinus, the Old English interlocutor who stands in for Augustine in the Latin. Augustinus, and here I'm using the AG spelling because that's how it is in the manuscript.
Yeah.
He um he talks about whether he is going to do the will of his Lord or not. And can you know the will of your Lord if you get a letter and a seal? Can you expect to have any prosperity if you don't follow your Lord's will? If you had to choose between your Lord's will and prosperity, which would you follow? Well, I'd like to have both, but he talks about kings in a couple of analogies in book three. Um, Actually, I guess this is really Ratio. It's Eushadwisness who talks about this, about kings are the ones who have a giant mansion in which some people get access to him and some people live in the dungeon. Kings are the people who throw you in jail where you can see out and see your friends, but other people look in and mock you, and you're of no use to them whatsoever. And it's just like this overwhelmingly negative view of secular lordship. I have a really hard time reconciling that with the guy who translated the pastoral care.
Right. Yeah.
And Godden also extends this argument to some of the positions that are occupied by the speakers in the Old English Boethius, which I can't speak to in as much detail. But we do know with fair amount of confidence that if the Old English Boethius and the Old English Soliloquies weren't written by just one person, they were written by two guys sitting in the same room, because the Old English Boethius quotes the Old English Soliloquies and the Old English Soliloquies quotes the Old English Boethius. So they were being written at the same time and quoting one another. And the Old English Soliloquies quotes the Latin Consolation and is heavily influenced by the Latin commentary tradition on the Consolation. And the Old English Boethius is influenced by the Latin Soliloquia as well. So I have a hard time seeing that as the product of anything other than a single authorship for the Old English Boethius and Soliloquies, but I don't think it was Ælfred. There's a couple more things too. The most important one, I think, is that colophon at the end of our only full-ish copy of the Old English Soliloquies doesn't say that Ælfred translated the work. It says that Ælfred selected the passages. And so that sounds to me like what's being translated here, what the direct source for most of the material is Ælfred's Enchiridion or handbook, which Asser tells us was the place where he wrote down passages that he loved. Because there's big chunks of the Soliloquia that are left out from the translation. And so maybe there were big chunks that Ælfred thought, this isn't pertinent, this isn't answering what I want to know about whatever he was interested in, fleshing out his understanding of the consolation of philosophy, perhaps, or other reasons that might have been sitting around for him to read. I will say that the one manuscript that's English and near contemporary with the Old English Soliloquies has a pseudo-Augustine homily and the Latin Rule for Canons by Crotagang of Metz. And so if that tells us anything about other things that someone might have been interested in when they were reading the Soliloquia in Latin, that's kind of helpful to think about, what could have been on someone's mind other than just filling in some of the gaps about the immortality of the soul when it comes to understanding Boethius's consolation. That all came out in a very nonlinear way. Do you want me to revisit any of that?
No, so that's perfect. The Enchiridion, if I'm not mistaken, the Old English translation mentions an Enchiridion, and because I know it's a fun little passage where he says Enchiridion othe handbok. He causes it right there as handbook in the Old English. I I I don't know if you remember, is that referring to Alfred's handbook or a different one? I don't remember.
Which text are you saying had the reference to the Enchiridion? Because I
The
was
the
thinking about Asser's
soliloquies, the
Life of
Old
Alfred.
English one. Yeah,
I
I
don't
forget.
think
I wish I
I
could
don't think
remember it
that's
off the
in
top of my
there.
head.
I'm pretty sure that I was when I comment on this at the end of my edition of the Old English, um, I'm I'm mostly just trying to understand why, like, what it could have meant for Alfred to have chosen the passages if I'm also arguing that he didn't translate the passages. So I don't
Hmm.
think there's a mention of the Enchiridion in the soliloquies, although I'll be mighty embarrassed if I am forgetting something
Well,
super
I
important.
mean, maybe I'm thinking of the consolation. Maybe this is one of those situations. And it's interesting that I agree that the consolation and the soliloquies, the tr Old English translations, it's very plausible to think that they were written by the same, or at least people right next to each other. But the consolation begins by saying it's written by King Alfred, which, might have been a later edition. We don't know. When I was talking with Daniel Anlazark about King Alfred, I asked him about the so-called miracle of learning Latin in like an hour or whatever it was, and his interpretation of that, which I think is a lot of people's interpretation of that, and it makes sense to me, is that what really is happening here is that he has sort of started to understand Latin a little bit, but when these things are being translated, his role was probably, just to kind of sit back and watch the Latin translators do their work and sort of give his, 2 cents on things as they're going along. I don't know what you think about that, but that seems very plausible to me, especially in these works.
It does. It does seem plausible. And you add on top of that some of the stuff that Malcolm Godden has written about like prefaces to works that appear in a ruler or a famous person's name, as happened in the Carolingian world on multiple occasions, that these things might have been added even contemporaneously with that person being alive. This doesn't have to be something that someone added in the 920s or the 930s thinking, how am I going to get someone to read my translation? Someone could well have made that in Ælfred's voice in the 890s. I think one thing that pushes me, there's two things really that make me think this is probably a product of after Ælfred's lifetime. One is that it's in manuscripts of the 920s, 930s that we start seeing greater interest in compiling philosophical texts that use that same sort of 10 categories reasoning. There's a Corpus Christi Cambridge manuscript that has a compilation of these sort of like philosophical primers, logical primers, and that seems to be something post-dating what we know of more securely documented Alfredian interests. In addition, I think that that nervous, paranoid character of Augustinus, who's so agitated about being thrown over by his temporal lord or being persecuted by his temporal lord, it's so closely paralleled in the lives of Dunstan and Athelwold, who were in the king's court in the 930s, 940s, and were just so heavily dependent on royal favor. And their vitae, which obviously are much later, nonetheless have these remarkable narrative similarities to the worries that the Old English interlocutor Augustinus has added to his character. Not he has added them, but he has had someone else has added them to his
Right.
character. The figure of Augustinus has become a bishop, right? When Augustine in the Soliloquia is a catechumen. And so there's one place where, like, gosh, somebody didn't read their confessions because this hadn't happened yet. But the bishop, the figure of the bishop in the Old English Soliloquies, actually, I should go back and say most people think that Augustinus was meant to be like a sort of king type figure, a mouthpiece for Ælfred and all his concerns about, supporting his supporters and distributing riches and food and things. I think he was a bishop. I think his concerns are very readily compared with the concerns of a bishop who's overseeing a house of canons, as in the Crotagang rule for canons that survives in that same manuscript, as the 10th century English copy of the Latin Soliloquia. And so I think that when we put all those things together and see that one of the major changes to the Old English Soliloquies has been to take Augustinus from a catechumen to a bishop, to take him from someone who was celibate because he was a philosopher to someone who is celibate because that's expected of bishops, and he recommends celibacy for priests. He's not concerned about philosophers, he's concerned about priests focusing on their divine service. All of that suggests to me a world where we see upwardly mobile church officials, aristocratic church officials, dependent on the whims of their secular lords, the kings in the south of England, basically. I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
realized halfway through that answer that I was putting the cart before the horse because I hadn't yet talked about the transformation of Augustinus from catechumen to bishop.
Yeah, but that makes sense. I remember being struck by the line where he talks about when I was reading the Old English, where he talks about that it's better for a praost. I think he says specifically "nabe thon habe," like to not have than to have a wife.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking like that seems like a very odd thing for Augustine to say, specifically calling it a priest. And sure enough, that seems to be an Old English edition. Are there any kind of other clues that we get from the way that the Old English translator seems to change the text that sort of tell us about what they were like or what they were thinking about?
Those are some of the main ones. Let me see if I can think of. There are other. I think in my mind these are conflated with the things that are characteristics of an author who has not read the Confessions. So, for
Right.
instance, Alypius becomes not Augustine's best friend, whom we know from other Latin works by Augustine was someone that Augustine deeply esteemed and even considered his like moral superior in a lot of ways. And yes, Alypius learned from Augustine, but they were social equals. He's called a knecht in the Old English. It's like,
Right.
okay, that's definitely a social inferior, no matter how you parse that word. Augustine of Hippo would never have called Alypius his knecht or any Latin equivalent. So that's one of those things you think, if you knew anything else about Alypius, you never would have made that change. The the bits about sharing out property. So the Old English part is based on the section of the Latin where the interlocutor Augustine autobiographically is talking about his engagement with Cicero's Hortensius and how reading this at a young age made him want to give up sensual desires and really restrain his indulgences in pursuit of wisdom, right? And the Old English version of the character can't do that. It's like, well, it's fine for me to want to give these up. And of course, I want to give them up for myself, but I also have to make sure that all of these followers of mine have what they need. And he says that on two different occasions. They're close together in the same passage, but he drives that point home. And there too, I see a bishop in the model of Crodegong's Rule for Canons who specifically um, has to account for the physical needs of the priests who are making up the cathedral household and his retinue. It's not okay for the bishop to just be so focused on asceticism that he's not managing church property correctly. And so that's another really big difference between Augustine of Hippo before he's a bishop and Augustinus in the Old English, who is already a bishop. And so, again, a reason why I think that whoever translated it really didn't know Augustine's biography. And this is a place where I part ways with Malcolm Godden, who wants to say, oh, yeah, he'd read a lot of other stuff by and about Augustine and made all these changes to make the Old English Augustinus much more like Augustine of Hippo. Like, much more like a bishop, yes, but not much
Yeah.
more like Augustine of Hippo in 386 to 387 when he was a catechumen, when he was pursuing celibacy for the sake of philosophy. And that passage that you quoted a minute ago, it's better for a priest to have a wife than to not have one. That also reflects sort of the ambivalence that characterize the actual situation on the ground. Lots of priests in early medieval England had wives. And so he can think it's better, but he probably shouldn't be too hard-nosed about it because people really weren't in early medieval England. I see Augustinus, the bishop, very much as a bishop of England in the early 10th century rather than a bishop of northern Africa in the 4th or 5th century. Another one of the places, and I know Malcolm Godden's dealt with this one really well, I think. He's always on about what the emperor, his like personal relationship with the emperor, Honorius, Theodosius, and that doesn't have any basis in the reality of the historical Augustine's life. I mean, not only because he gets the dates wrong, but because he's not directly dependent on the emperor for favor and promotion. Whereas Augustinus seems to pretend to be, right? Or he's put into the right continent for the historical Augustine, but not in the right dates, and certainly not in a realistic relationship with the Roman emperor.
Yeah, I remember specifically because I had some difficulty deciding how I was going to pronounce it. But at the beginning, he's referred to as Cartagena Bishop,
Hmm.
which I thought that was interesting.
Yeah,
Real quick, for the
wrong.
sake of the yeah,
And
um,
there are a couple of other texts that refer to Augustine as Bishop of Carthage. There's the history of Abingdon Abbey. Um, identifies the feast day, August 28th, as the feast of Augustine, Bishop of Carthage. And so you're
Mm.
thinking, maybe that error was floating around in that milieu that had to do with Athelwold, who was attached to Abingdon for a while. And so you think, maybe so.
Yeah. Real quick, for the sake of the listener, the word that we were talking about just a second ago, knecht,
Yes.
that Augustine in the Old English version calls Alypius, or the Ishadwiesness, the sort of the thinking thing, the ratio, asks him whether or not he would like to know Thien Knecht, your boy, is, I guess, the best way to translate that.
Yeah.
That's the word that we get knight from. So Knight, which would explain the spelling, because it in Old English was pronounced Knecht. But like was just mentioned, it was probably like servant or boy in the ninth century when this work was being translated. So yeah, very odd if you actually do know who Alypius is.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I add on there because
yeah, of course.
what the Old English elaborates there is really remarkable. This is not, it doesn't have precedent in the Latin what Augustinus, the Old English interlocutor, says. I would like to know Alypius, according to his ignathank, I think is the word, because then I can know whether he's loyal to me or not. It's like,
Yeah, yeah.
oh, yeah, the real Augustine would not have said that at all. But there is this, I guess the best way I can describe it is in the Latin soliloquies, Augustine is really concerned with horizontal friendships, sometimes with, Ambrose, but Ambrose isn't that high above Augustine. They talk, they hang out, right? In the Old English soliloquies, it's all vertical relationships. And even the close friendship of Augustine and Alypius gets turned into Augustine and the Knecht. And and then mostly there's worries about who's up above Augustine and who is going to inflict his whims upon him. And that is a really major change, I think, to the whole tenor of the work that then, sorry, I thought this was going to be a short digression, but
No, no
I think
worries.
it's a really important change that the Old English makes to the Latin, that where the Latin proceeds often by syllogisms and logical demonstrations of the soul's immortality, the soul's incorporeality, that truth resides in subjecto, in the soul as in a subject, as opposed to accidentally. All those things proceed in a really schoolroomy kind of way in the Latin. In the Old English, most of that gets abandoned. And Ratio sort of threatens, or sorry, not Ratio, Yeshadwisness threatens Agustinus, saying, are you seriously questioning this? Because that makes you disloyal to Christ and his thanes, his servants. And you're like, whoa, where did that come from? You just, never mind learning. If you want to inquire about these things, you're a disloyal Christian. And so again, this everything turns on the hierarchy of relationships, I think. And so it's not it's a concern that comes through in the kinds of relationships that Augustinus has with people, but also the kind of relationship that Yeshadwisness thinks he should have with God and with written authorities.
And I'm no Augustinian scholar, but it really seems to me that he was almost constantly in a state of questioning, you know? So it is very odd that, you would then write him to be like, don't you believe the apostolic fathers and all of the people who were there, that kind of thing.
Yep. Yep.
The last thing specifically regarding this work that I want to talk about is the thing that very interesting to me and my sort of grad student friends and colleagues who work a lot with like manuscripts and texts is that this one is really messed up. I mean it's shockingly different in terms of orthography, the way things that are written than anything else I've read in Old English. You get like comically bad spellings of words. The ea diphthong sometimes gets written as a, sometimes as sometimes as ash, sometimes as just an e. Like it, it was almost like they were randomizing vowels at times. What's going on here?
Oh, I wish I knew. I wish I knew. I don't think any one thing can account for it all. Eric Stanley has that great article about the scribe wanting to archaize his spellings, and so using more ash in places where things had been simplified by the scribe's day. I don't know that I buy that. I mean, I deeply respect the work of Eric Stanley, but I think I just don't know why a later 12th century scribe would care about archaizing the spelling, because the same scribe clearly didn't care about spelling something like Michel or Mitchell correctly, because he spells it like Miclc, completely unpronounceable consonant clusters. He has huge problems representing consonant clusters on the page, and not in a way that simplifies them or that seems to represent pronunciation changes in the 12th century, not in a way that seems to represent how an Anglo-Norman scribe might have perceived these clusters. They're just nonsense. One of my favorite bits in the old edition by Wilhelm Enter is where he has misspelled simla, the word for always, 3 times in a short passage, and he always spells it smila. And so the apparatus criticus, I mean, the main text says simla blah blah blah, simla blah blah blah, simla blah blah blah. The apparatus criticus says smila smila smila, right? Which I just think
Right.
is hilarious. But that's because I'm a big nerd. So some of the spellings can be attributed to early Middle English habits. Most of them can't. And I have tried to do some research on whether there's any recognized cognitive deficit in language processing that might account for some of that. There are some articles that attempt to identify dyslexia in certain medieval German scribes, for instance. I'm like uncomfortable with the subject, even of trying to retrospectively diagnose someone with a language processing deficit. But I also look at those spellings and I think, yeah, sure, some of them are early Middle English and some of them are completely unpronounceable. And if you were looking at another page that had the right spellings on it, there's no, I mean, scribal errors, sure, but these are not scribal errors like any that I'm familiar with from anywhere else. And we know that this doesn't go all the way back in the history of the text, because we've got that little bit in a mid 11th century manuscript, it's Cotton Tiberius A3, that has part of the opening prayer in Old English excerpted, where the spellings are pretty normal mid 11th century stuff. So I think it was an idiosyncratic scribe. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, I don't have a better answer for that. I wish I did. Really
Well,
wish
I
I
was
did.
I was just talking with Brian Murdoch about Old High German, and he mentioned that same inquiry of whether or not, the scribe might have had dyslexia. And I will say though, I have a couple colleagues with which we do sort of like challenge, where when we're reading through these manuscripts, if there's a word that's like particularly difficult to read, we'll just crop it out of context and then send it to see, and everyone will guess to see what it means. And it started because one of my colleagues works a lot with Aldred, the Northumbrian scribe, and his Old English can be very, very challenging. But I rarely get to contribute because I mostly work with early West Saxon, very
Right.
standard stuff. It was only when I was reading the soliloquies that I got to take a couple of them, and it's like just like nonsense words,
Yeah.
and everyone, it was so fun to see everyone try to guess what it was, mostly unsuccessfully.
And his grasp of Latin wasn't that great either, because there's that bit, one of the times that he mentions de videndo deo, it's 2 words, dividendo deo. And and then you think, well, wait a minute, was he writing from dictation? Because it would be harder to represent complex consonant clusters if Old English wasn't your first language and you were writing from dictation. But other attempts to argue things like that, like I believe Janet Bately had an article trying to argue that for a Welsh scribe of something. Like people just tend not to buy it. And I get that we can't prove that someone's writing from dictation most of the time. I just feel like there's a number of factors there that I can't ever account for all of them with one explanation.
Mhm.
But I
What
like
was
dividendo
your
Deo on the dividing of God. I mean, that's heretical.
yeah.
Everything is.
Yeah, I get maybe into like the Trinity, but it's not divided according to most Christians at least.
Right.
Um, well, so what was your motivation in publishing this book, in publishing the Old English and the Latin in one edition?
Um, it it was not something that I would have thought to take up because I think of myself as someone who is comfortable thinking about the relationship between Latin and Old English stuff and less comfortable editing Old English. But a scholar whom I deeply respect, who knew my 2011 monograph, Anglo-Saxon Psychologies, thought that I would be able to provide, a translation that would be a considerable advance on the previous available translations because where the tendency in the scholarship for a long time was, what is the Old English Soliloquies about? Why did anyone write it this way? What was wrong with Ælfred for choosing this? Did he just want to translate something by Augustine? Why is Augustine the interlocutor sometimes a king and sometimes a priest? And they were just like, nah. The way I wrote about it in my first monograph was that it was actually pretty explicable if you look at this as a text to help people understand something that Boethius isn't coming out and saying. So I was sort of flattered to think, well, gosh, if I translate this with that kind of thing in mind and have, the opportunity to do a little commentary, and it's only a little bit in the Dumbarton Oaks series, that would be a cool thing to be responsible for. I would like that. I would like to bring the Old English Soliloquies to a greater level of understanding by readers because I think it's super interesting. As I worked on it and did not discover some latent vein of powers to edit Old English, but fortunately it's a pretty simple one to edit, I did discover that I really loved working on the reception of the Soliloquia, and that because people had not really acknowledged the amount of glossing and marking and commentary that's present in the manuscripts of the 8th to 12th centuries, there was a lot that could be said about what people saw in the Soliloquia that could help us understand why someone would translate it into Old English, why someone would bring it to England at all, why someone would think it was worth studying, because of course someone has to think it's worth studying in Latin before they decide to translate it into Old English. And I
Right,
know that
yeah.
sounds like a very basic thing, but I think that's a super important point to make. The other point that I like to make is when you want to look at what was the purpose, what was the meaning behind an Alfredian translation or anyone else's translation, you don't look at the stuff that Ælfred injected that was a change. I mean, if what you wanted to write about was kingship and lordship, you wouldn't choose the Old English, or you wouldn't choose the Soliloquia. You would choose the Pastoral Care, or you would choose some Mirror for Princes, right? If
Mhm.
you're choosing the Soliloquia as something to translate, you have to have latched onto the value in that Latin text first. And you figure that out not by finding what people changed about it, but what people put into it when they were studying, what they were writing in the margins. So that I found to be the most fun part, and I'm still trying to finish publishing article-length studies about stuff that I found about all those early medieval Soliloquia manuscripts in the Latin, and that's been my absolute favorite thing. And that also trying to figure out what the other Latin sources were. There seems to have been a Florilegium of Latin Sententiae by Augustine, or that contained Augustinian and other sententiae, that I think is responsible for these like weird little insertions of non-Soliloquia and non-Boethius material now and again. And so I've been trying to follow up stuff like that. That I think is something that I'm getting a lot more out of publication wise, and I hope other people are getting more out of my publications that way than just out of having the Old English text reproduced again. Although I do really like it that I've been able to do it in a facing page forum because the previous translations, again, assumed incoherence on the part of the translator, and I've always assumed coherence. I also think that the study of the Latin manuscripts has helped me to understand why the translator added a book three. Some of the manuscripts actually label whatever text is after the Soliloquia as book three. And so there was this perception among people who studied it in the Latin that there was a book three. Now, it's never the stuff that's in the Old English book three, but the idea that this needed to be continued and that it had been written by, I mean, that a third book had been written by Augustine to continue addressing these problems, is attested in the manuscripts of the Soliloquia that are around from the early Middle Ages.
Hmm. How did you originally get into studying medieval languages and stuff like that?
This one's a short answer. You'll be relieved.
Oh yeah.
Um, in high school, we watched at one point those videos, The Story of English. Um, and I went back to try to watch these last summer, and now they seem hopelessly antiquated, but they were so good. I had no idea about the history of the language before Shakespeare, and very little idea about Shakespeare. I think I was a junior in high school when we watched these. And yeah, learning about those earlier stages of the language, I was just like, that is so interesting. And then the summer between my junior and senior year, my English teacher, knowing that we were going to start the year off reading the Canterbury Tales, gave us for our summer reading a historical novel. It's just a romance novel. It's Catherine by Anya Seton, and it is a romance about Geoffrey Chaucer's sister-in-law, Catherine Swynford, who was the mistress and then wife of John of Gaunt. It's so well researched. It was completely gripping for, a 16-year-old girl to read. I loved it. And I just really wanted to know more after that. And when I went off to college, I was a biology major until about halfway through when I realized, oh, actually, I mean, I was still a biology major and finished that part of my degree, but it hadn't occurred to me ever to be a medievalist for real to make money until yeah, a friend of mine was like, well, yeah, I'm going to go get my PhD in history and I'm going to be a medieval history professor. I was like, people do that, which was a ridiculous thing to think, because by that time I'd already taken my Chaucer class and my Beowulf class with wonderful Howell Chickering, who was, I mean, the
Oh,
of Facing Page Beowulf fame. He was
yeah.
my undergraduate Old English teacher, and he was marvelous, but I could just never see myself doing that yet. And then, yeah, about halfway through, I was like, oh, I could major in medieval studies. And then I didn't know what I wanted to do after college, but reflecting on it, when I took a few years to teach high school, I liked teaching Latin better than I liked teaching chemistry. And the library didn't give me headaches the way smelling the chemicals in the genetics lab did. So I thought, I'll try. I really missed humanities research more than I missed genetics research. So I thought, I will try that. And I did. And that's, yeah, I was very fortunate to end up in a job where my research is so well supported. So
Mhm. Well, I would be remiss if we did not talk about what I think you've been more focused on lately, and what most people might who follow you might, specifically have been reading about lately, your work on this. Could you tell us a bit about the cheese making stuff? So the history of cheese making, why you started researching that, what you've learned, what you find interesting about it, just before we end.
I will. I'll say too that nobody has been reading my stuff because I have published virtually nothing on this so far. I've given a lot of lectures, but I'm still trying to work up exactly how I want to put some of this stuff out there in print. So I think I was in grad school at the farmers market in South Bend, looking around at all the different cheeses. And just as a question about food, I started thinking, cheese is all made of the same stuff, except for the people who put like herbs or seeds in. Why are they all so different? And I started reading about how cheese is made and how, cheese is basically like a little farm for bacteria. And the way that the flavors get so different is that the bacteria in the cheese and the fungi on the cheese, and then you can have fungus on or you can have bacteria on the outside as well. All those microorganisms produce flavors by digesting the milk solids. And their metabolic byproducts are the things that we perceive as odors and tastes, odors and
Mhm.
flavors. And I just thought that was really cool. And I thought, okay, well, what about in the Middle Ages? And there were like no books that I could find that would explain how people did that in the era before they knew that bacteria were there, right? They could get milk to coagulate really predictably. But micromanaging the flavor when you don't actually know what you're micromanaging, that's a huge deal. And I just started researching and, yeah, again, found that people weren't telling me the answers I wanted, either on the scientific front or on the historical front. And because I was a biology major, I could research both. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I started doing it more seriously after I'd been here at OSU for about a decade, and had my first book out of the way. I gave a paper at the early medieval English conference in Munich about a decade ago, and yeah, people are like, "Oh, that's really interesting," and I was very encouraged. So I've tried to branch out. The paper I gave at Southeast Medieval Association a couple of weeks ago was on a Latin treatise on cheese that was published in 1477. So I'm stretching length chronologically as well because I get very uncomfortable talking about other things from 1477. But if it's about cheese, I'm good. Um,
Right.
the thing that I would really like to do, and this is much easier said than done. Like the documentary research and reading about the archaeological stuff, I'm good with. But I think what really needs to happen is some experimental replication of cheeses because there are, again, things that the archaeological and written evidence can't tell us. And so I think replicative experimentation combined with anthropological observation can open up a lot of doors of new knowledge about pre-modern cheeses, not just medieval, but really anything prior to the industrial age. Although the more I learn about the late Middle Ages, the more I see how how important it was that cheese is going from something that most households do because they're close to they have livestock and they're close to them to something that becomes increasingly specialized as the population grows more urban and not everybody is keeping milking livestock in their backyards anymore, so you get more specialist cheese making in very large batches. So I'm still coming to grips with that big shift.
Well, I'll be very interested to see what you do come out with there. And for anyone who's interested, the Soliloquies book will be linked in the description for anyone who wants to get it. And yeah, Leslie Lockett, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Graham, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to talk about the Old English soliloquies because, as you can see, I'm just really enthusiastic about them in their own right and in what it tells us about 8th, ninth, 10th century engagements with Augustine.